evening. 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 1. Good evening. My name is Denis Stolyarov. I'm an assistant curator at Pushkin House, and I'm really glad to see you tonight for what is going to be a fascinating discussion about this book that you see here, The Afterlife of the Soviet Man, published by Bloomsbury Academic. Bloomsbury Academic has this wonderful series, Russian Shorts, and they invite prominent scholars to write small, accessible books on various topics. And it's a brilliant initiative that was launched before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but fortunately they haven't cancelled the initiative as far as I know, and it is the next in a series of jams that they have produced. And so I'm really happy to welcome Gulnaz and Svetlana for discussion about it. So Professor Gulnaz Sharafutdinova is Professor of Russian Politics and Director of the King's Russia Institute. Her previous books are award-winning The Red Mirror, Putin's Leadership and Russia's Insecure Identity, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And before that, Gulnaz published Political Consequences of Crony Capitalism Inside Russia in 2010. Svetlana is a professor in sociology at the School of Social Sciences at the London Metropolitan University, and she is convener of the university's Interdisciplinary Research Forum. Svetlana's latest book is Gangs of Russia, From the Streets to the Corridors of Power, published by Cornell University Press in 2015. Please welcome.
Sorry, but I think you heard me, right? Sorry? Yes, good evening, everyone. I'll repeat my introductory words. We will start with 10-15 minutes introduction of the book. I'll tell you the story of how I came to write it and what the book is about. And I will have to start from the admission that the book might not be exactly about what you think it is about, and even Pushkin House in its earlier announcements made a certain presupposition about what the book is about. You might come here and think that the book is about the homo sovieticus and what are Soviet people about and how post-Soviet person looks like, but I'm going actually to tell you that the book is about us, ourselves, and it's an attempt to understand how we come to think in certain ways, how we come to know others in certain ways, and how politics and political context becomes embedded in our knowledge, and why it's important to understand, because our knowledge also creates blind spots, and these blind spots are important to know because they might be more relevant for addressing certain issues of the day than what we think we know. And I would say that homo sovieticus is that concept that we need to question. So the book is deconstructing the concept. After I present this, I think Svetlana will step in with her observations and questions, and then we will open it up to your questions and your maybe criticisms or suggestions or questioning. So I will very much welcome what you think about this as well. So for me, the story of the book started actually with the first book I wrote on the topic, which is The Red Mirror, Putin's Leadership and Russia's Insecure Identity. And that book, pretty much I had to write it after 2014, annexation of Crimea, because in summer 2014, it became very, very clear that the gap in understanding of what's happening in Russia that was shared by Russian citizens and that was shared in the Western publics couldn't be wider than at any time in the history that I know of. The way that Russian society reacted to the annexation of Crimea was very euphoric. It gave them a sense of progress, a sense of well-being, a sense of a hope for the future, while in the West we were looking at Russia that was revanchist, that was bringing aggression back in foreign policy and its international relationships, that was going somewhere no good, that was doing something no good. And when I was trying to understand at that moment this puzzle, the first idea, the first concept that came, that I worked on, was the idea of what I refer to as cognitive path dependency. I was raised and educated partially in the Soviet Union and in New Russia. I left Russia in 1994 in January, so very early on. And I remember very well that the Soviet society, the way I experienced it, without access to foreign information, without access to many books that only came available during perestroika times, like Freud and Nietzsche, etc., had its own ways of thinking, because theories, Marxism, Leninism, and a lot of literature, culture, it was all very much specific to the Soviet Union, Soviet civilization. It was its own world, its own civilization. And so it made sense to think that maybe the gap that I observed in 2014 might be one way or another linked to certain path dependency or certain inertia associated with how people came to think in the Soviet Union. For example, Marxism in the Soviet Union took very much a format of vulgar economic reductionism, right? So if in more religious Protestant Christian societies you had, remember how the Bible starts, first was the word, right? Economic foundation and superstructure relationships very much brought to people to thinking about how it's not the spirit, but the material reality is very much primary, right? So those observations brought me to this idea of, okay, maybe it was something about this shared mental models, cognitive patterns, mentality, etc. And so I went into studying the term homo sovieticus and sociologists who have contributed to developing that term. And my book actually came in this search for answering the puzzle in a very different direction. I focused on identities, I focused on leadership, I focused on legacies as they were manipulated and used by the leadership and by propaganda in conjuncture with the 1990s and the transition of the 1990s. So I came at the moment, in the direction of actually not thinking or rejecting homo sovieticus and the sociological research that went into it and the concept how it was developed. So the book was not about homo sovieticus, but because I went through that path and because I saw that this way of thinking is becoming very popular and prominent in the public sphere, so that public intellectuals in Moscow, outside Moscow, in Western countries are very much prone to thinking about the Russian society in terms of the Soviet experiences and Soviet mental models and homo sovieticus. I thought it is important to write about this concept and how it came about. So the book is more of an intellectual biography of individuals who could be credited with developing the term, who gave the concept its meaning, its content. And so it starts with observing the life and the ideas of Cheslaw Milosz, who wrote Captive Mind. His book came out in 1952. It continues with looking at other Eastern European dissidents like Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian journalist who escaped from Bulgaria and worked for BBC, lived in London. The famous umbrella case in Waterloo Bridge, he was poisoned. The book speaks about Alexander Zinoviev, the Soviet dissidents, who wrote his Homo Sovieticus. The book speaks about Vladimir Bukovsky, another Soviet dissident, human rights fighter in the Soviet Union. And then it moves to the most empirically, sociologically, scientifically developed concept of the Soviet man, simple Soviet man, that was created by Yuri Levada, a Soviet sociologist who in the 1950s and 60s had exposure to American sociological theories, who was very much into reading George Orwell, a book that is very popular in Russia right now, and not only in Russia, in outside Russia, of course, too. Where I go into, you know, what type of analytical foundations Yuri Levada brought into developing his analysis of what the late Soviet person was about. And then it moves to Natalia Kozlova, a sociocultural anthropologist who worked in the 1990s in Moscow and studied Soviet society through people's documents, through things that Soviet people created in their everyday life, postcards, memoirs, diaries, things like that. And if there is something to learn from these intellectual biographies, are a few things. So number one, the observations that Eastern European and Soviet dissidents made about the psychological effects of communism on individuals were very much part of their anti-communist struggle. They were able to develop these observations in the context when they were pushed out or had an opportunity to go into exile outside their communist, Stalinist, frequently regimes, because they didn't agree with the system didn't agree with them, but they had an opportunity to escape. And once outside, they were able to criticize communism, but also to criticize the system's effects on individual behavior, on individual mentalities, on individual psychology. Now, the interesting thing is that these ideas were very much needed, wanted, and were popularized in the West. Frequently, for these dissidents, these ideas were based and structured against their understanding of how individual development is in the West. They had this ideal in their mind that people in the West, in democratic countries, are different. They are free, they are autonomous, they're liberal. Right? Now, what happened in their real experience is that when they reached the West, and you see it through their letters and writings, they all of a sudden realized that their ideals were just that, ideals. Reality was very different. So in almost all their memories and memoirs, you read how they were disappointed with the reality. Zinoviev, for example, writes about how for every Soviet man and every Soviet bureaucrat or every Soviet commoner, there is a Western commoner, exactly like the antipode, but very similar to the Soviet, right? So they went through frequent reappraisals of what their ideals were once they came to experience that reality. Many of them were quite nostalgic and became critical of the Western realities and Western politics. But why this is important is to suggest that these early writings for them were tools of anti-communist struggle, right? And they were based on the ideals, not knowledge of how things work in the West and how individual life is and individual personalities are in the West. Once they have experienced it, they said, no, life is pretty similar, has ups and downs, good things and bad things. Some things are better in the Soviet Union, in the society, some things are worse in the West. So that black and white corresponding assessments that we see in their writings about the effects of totalitarian system or effects of the regime on an individual, whether the regime is capable of producing a very particular species, right? This type of knowledge was part of their political views, as opposed to a neutrally shared information that we can now take that this is how it is, right? So that's one important observation, I think, that comes about, I think, in a book. And when I move, so this is about the dissidents and what the ideas were for them. When we look into the sociologist Yuri Levada, also I show analytically, right? I'm a political scientist, I'm also quite theoretically driven. I show how his empirical analysis, right? It was based on big surveys, a big survey that he was commissioned in 1989. And for 3-4 years, and then even thereafter, they had first all Union and then all Russia surveys about how can we compose a portrait of the late Soviet man, and then they continued that survey to study the Russian society too. And I show in the book that this research project that then was published as a book, it relied on 2 important analytical pillars. One pillar is a theory of totalitarianism, that there is a totalitarian state, and this totalitarianism creates certain effects, and it produces a specific type of an individual. That link between the system and an individual was very much based on a systems theory in sociology developed in the 50s by Talcott Parsons. It was called structuralism or structural functionalism, and this sociological theory was very fashionable in the 50s and 60s. It was outdated by the 70s. In the United States, it was sort of pushed away for different types of theorizing. In the Soviet Union, for those sociologists who had access to it, it was very popular and attractive because it was a systemic theory that explained stagnation. It explained equilibrium. So Marxism was also a systemic theory, but Marxism claimed to explain change. But by stagnation period in the 70s, you needed in the Soviet Union to explain equilibrium, lack of change, and structural functionalism did just that. The problem is when Levada tried to put this theory into an empirical testing, the time was late 80s and early 90s. This theory was long outdated. Now, the paradox is that even today, when Levada Center does surveys, and in 2011, Economist published The Soviet Man is Back, or Homo Sovieticus is revived, there is a revival of Homo Sovieticus, they use the same analytical foundations based on which they do their surveys and based on which this concept of a Homo Sovieticus is created. So I try to show that, in fact, in sociological theory, in political philosophy, in anthropology, there have been a big development and that allows us to think in different, creative, more updated ways about how we analyze society, how we analyze individuals, so that we don't have to produce this observation that a specific political system creates a product. And because it's a totalitarian system, the product is a damaged product. Right? And now the important thing is that when Russia started war in 2014 and with the military invasion in 2022, right? For us, what is important to understand is how we think. And if you lived during the Cold War, you were part of the media environment of the Cold War, these ideas come to your mind immediately. In political psychology, there is this term availability heuristic. Right? And then you say, oh, these Ruskies, these Russians, they're always like that, they were like that during the Cold War, right? But what I'm trying to suggest is, and I will come to the blind spots, how the knowledge we think we have, which is very much politically determined, creates blind spots. One interesting thing, one important blind spot, it's not an interesting thing, for me it's interesting analytically, but it's a significant knowledge that has not been developed to study Russian society, for example, today, and that we start talking about now is the issue of racism. Or one might call it Russian chauvinism, or another one might call it imperialism. The way the Russian Empire has developed was by expanding into controlling different other minority groups in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, Urals, and further, right? That's how European societies have expanded, but But there was decolonization in the European empires, right? And the issues of racism and decolonization have been discussed. Well, this issue has not been really discussed in the Soviet Union because Soviet Union presented itself as a non-imperial and decolonized country that helps the freedoms of other countries. Well, but what was not studied and what was not appreciated are the long-term attitudinal or ethnic hierarchies that are alive until today in Russia. And that's, for example, one issue that Levada, who a sociologist and sociologists today, who need to study, who need to address, who need to bring it into the public attention. And so while we are talking about homo sovieticus or the effects of totalitarianism, we are not addressing other important issues that are key to understanding certain problems today and that are key for potential future of Russian Federation if it is to exist. How does it organize inter-ethnic, inter-societal life based on values of equality, recognition, and if I may end with my own little idealistic Russia version, it's the Russia that can recognize ethnocultural diversity as a new oil. So when the fossil fuels are out of the resource bases and we are all into the renewable economy, if that future is imaginable, what is the resource that Russia can rely on? And the diverse inter-ethnic, intercultural, multicultural society, if the Russian ethnic group, the state-forming ethnic group, recognizes that as a value, then that's where the big resource might be lying. I think I'll probably stop at that, but I look forward to your questions and comments as well.
Thanks, Gulnaz. I must say, I must probably make a disclosure that I actually used to work. I used to work with Levada for several years at the time when he and his colleagues came up with the whole idea of homo sovieticus. And I remember this enormous enthusiasm of people who were sort of who were not given any opportunity before to do any social research, and yet, they read lots of books. As you say, I saw Parsons on the shelves, and Hannah Arendt, and so on. They loved books. They loved talking. They loved their seminars, and now was the moment for them to put their ideas under test. And actually, these were absolutely ideal conditions for social research, because this was Tseom Center for Public Opinion Research was funded by Russian government and trade unions, and so you didn't even have to bid for any contracts. They gave you money and you could study whatever you liked. Never again this happened. So they were very, 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 very enthused by all this and worked, all hours without weekends and holidays. And although the subject they studied was supposed to be sort of passive Soviet person, in fact, people were sending field questionnaires by post. Some people were sending money to support the work of sociologists. It was very, very exciting time. And yet, looking back at it and after reading Gulnaz's book, it is clear that the whole idea of Soviet personality, homo sovieticus, was already becoming sort of redundant because society was changing very, very rapidly. And it was, as you say, Gulnaz, is a product of its time, of the Cold War, of people being, in opposition, internal opposition to their own government, and also, in a sense, quite judgmental about the people who they saw as supporting this government. So but what's also happening now is, as you said, this idea has been revived, and there is this kind of amalgamation between this whole concept of a Soviet personality and the concept of some kind of civilizational pathology, you know, in Russian people, that Russian people, because of the Soviet past, because of the imperial past, are incapable of democracy. People are incapable of imagining any kind of progress, of modernization. So a lost cause for humanity, in a sense, right? So do you think then that you know, the idea of a Soviet person, homo sovieticus, should really be buried, you know, in the sense that it's a part of the past which does not help us think about the present or the future?
Yes, I think we should look at it as in the context of how knowledge should be historically situated, especially when we talk about sociological, social science, historical knowledge. Like in history, right, the winners usually write history, right? And homo sovieticus, from that perspective, was expressive of the Soviet collapse, Soviet loss, and the fact that the Soviet civilization went down the historical drain, right? And what left out of it was this concept. So once historically situated, as a historically situated knowledge that reflects that the politics of the time, but might not have any type of relationship to today, in that sense it has, because it's an intellectual creation, right? So it has a meaning and it has the right to exist as an intellectual artifact of a specific politics and historical moment. So in that sense, but not as an, as a term, as a definitional term that has anything to do with the realities of today. That's how I would probably accept its existence.
Your book is called The Afterlife of the Soviet Man. And even if we put aside for now the intellectual history and its life, the life of the concept, clearly, there are certain certain values or orientations among the older generation of Russian people who have, in their majority, enthusiastically supported Putin, with different degrees of enthusiasm, but still supported the war and so on. So can we then speak about some kind of afterlife of the Soviet mentality, or is it something that is produced perhaps by the history of the 90s, by the political decisions made then and in the 2000s, rather than the mentality of people?
So here you bring me to the analysis that I went through in the book that I mentioned to you about the red mirror. And there, I tried to think, because we cannot say that Soviet Union and Soviet history has nothing to do with contemporary Russia. We are all from our childhood, right? And countries have history, right? So we cannot entirely get rid of them, right? And I'm not suggesting to do that. What I'm suggesting is a much more dynamic relationships between different factors that are brought together through leadership, political communication, propaganda. And what I'm looking in the book, so as opposed to this personality type, right? So that's where the homo sovieticus leads us, that the Soviet Union has produced a specific enduring traits in personality, right? So that one I'm denying, that one I'm rejecting. There are no enduring Soviet traits produced in personality, so that you can suggest that people who live in Russia, because of their experience in the Soviet Union, they're somehow different from anyone who lives in any other country, right? But where we could see certain how legacies come into being is through when through propaganda and when leadership tries to manipulatively bring certain ideas, certain templates, certain shared models, mental models, and make them work and make them resonant. One such thing that happened in Russia, I claim, is the return of the discourse of exceptionalism. And to a certain extent, the discourse of exceptionalism, Russian exceptionalism, is embedded in the Soviet exceptionalism model that was taught to Soviet kids from early on. That you have a very special Soviet state, exceptional Soviet state, with its own purpose, with its own achievements, with its own ideology, and that leads humanity and definitely the Soviet people towards some better future. Now, the interesting thing is that the Soviet exceptionalism discourse is a different and second variation on the Russian exceptionalism discourse that historically also developed in the 1990s. I'm sorry, in the 19th century. In the 19th century, when Moscow as a third Rome idea was discovered from the writings of a monk, 16th century monk, and in the 19th century, these ideas were brought back to legitimize the backward Russian Tsarist empire. We are actually with Peter Rutland writing a sort of this analysis of Russian exceptionalism discourses by showing these different fashions. And today, the Kremlin, from at least 2013, 2014, has been very much building on this civilizational difference of the Russian state and Russian society and working on bringing back these exceptionalism discourses. So that's one of the things. In the book, though, I show how this, the other component that is important and that was also important in the Soviet states was the enemy, this image that the Soviet state was surrounded by enemies. So if you read textbooks, history textbooks, it was very much organized around how the Soviet state was always surrounded by enemies. And this vision of the enemy, this vision of Russia as a fortress, has also returned in Russian society. Now, what I'm trying to suggest is that when these images have existed in the not that far future, they are easier to bring back in a specific context if they resonate. And to make them resonate, the other element of the propaganda machine in Russia worked to build the trauma of the 1990s. Because the post-Soviet transition, the economic reforms, the social problems that emerged were very painful in the society, but not only in Russia. They were painful in other Eastern European states, they were painful in the Baltic states, they were painful in Central Asia, in the Caucasus. But the interesting thing is that only in Russia have the 1990s turned into this moment of trauma, a moment of anarchy and chaos against which Putin's leadership has been legitimated, right? So once that trauma resonated, it was just one simple step to say, but we're exceptional, we don't need Western path, etc. Western path, we didn't, it didn't work for us. Or, Russia has its own history to rely on, its own civilization, we don't need to be taught, etc. So the bringing back of certain resonant Soviet ideas and even pre-Soviet ideas, if we speak in terms of Russian exceptionalism, occurred on the basis of also referring to the trauma and to the sort of black hole of the 1990s.
Great. And maybe the last question before we open up to the audience. So we're here in this wonderful room, and in a sense we're talking about the Soviet personality, but we're surrounded by images of new Russia. These are radical feminists who are protesting against the state, stand with Ukraine. So the whole new Russia, which has been suppressed and almost crushed, and maybe even completely crushed now by Putin. So in your book, you have a chapter about Yuri Dudz. So who represents this new Russia? And the new ideas about civic duty, patriotism, achievement, about dignity, about trying to find ways to solve social problems and so on. So why have you decided to put this into your book?
Yes, so as I was deconstructing the term homo sovieticus, right, I needed to think about how does post-homo sovieticus or post-sovieticus, homo post-sovieticus look like. And after 2014, it was important to find some element and grain of hope if we are not giving up, you know, on the Russia's future, and I am open. Right now, of course, there is a lot of pessimism, but I do believe in historical, you know, there is struggle, there is dynamics, there is change, there is no predetermination, right? So if we are to look for where are the sources of potential change in the future, can we find them? And Yuri Levada, a journalist, a blogger, video blogger, who has gone through quite a dramatic cultural individual transformation from where he started his blogging and his audiences and his conversation to where he has reached, and you can observe it. And if you include the fact that his videos and documentaries about Russia and Russian cultural figures are watched by sometimes 10, 12 and more million of viewers, right? To me, that suggested that the way he presented himself could be seen as one of the, that he's like one of the role models who offers to the Russian, to his viewers, a compelling idea, image of the self, how a Russian self, a modern Russian self could look like, right? So therefore, I inquired into Dud and his creations and the topics he covers and the questions he asked to find the elements of this new identity cues, how he can play as a role model for Russians who watch him. If there are millions of people who are watching him, they find something in him. What does he give to them? And in the conclusion, as one element of potential hope for how Russia can look like, what are those identity models available to them, I analyzed Yuri Levada's presentation and self-presentation, and what I found was an image that is not much different from the identity models that are followed by Western youth. You know, it's someone who is in business in terms of being modern, earning good money, being cosmopolitan and open to travel, knowing languages, being interested in culture, and then you see how the civic orientation and aspect in Dud is growing through time, and how he starts transmitting these messages, broadcasting the messages about how he, and therefore his viewers, and the chosen interlocutors whom he interviews and whom he shows, people as well as individuals, are very much civic-oriented patriots who care about what's happening in the Russian provinces, how beautiful Russian nature is, how important it is to take care of the disabled, of kids, of building soccer fields in some villages, of creating organizations or institutions to help alcoholics. Sort of, he started addressing social problems, and as a person who has achieved a lot and who I would likely think, I think probably is very well, he's doing quite well financially, for him to bring to the public these issues and to bring forward best practices and good models of what it is to be a young, successful Russian man, that's the beautiful image, and that's the beautiful, wonderful role model to follow for Russians. So to me, that was a seed of hope in terms of what are the identity models that were offered to Russians today that are unlike the patriotism that is advanced through the Russian propaganda system by people like Vladimir Solovyov, that build on emotions of hatred, fear, aggressiveness. So this was a very different alternative to those narratives and to those messages. Focus not on something about Georgia, Ukraine, or the United States, but focus on problems inside the country. What can you do? How can you help? And how the land, society, communities could be transformed through local actions or through the actions and financial support of civic-minded individuals in Moscow, in many other cities in Russia. So that's the model that Dud suggested. Of course, today he is abroad. He's in the list of foreign agents and is not welcome in Russia at this moment. But he still continues to produce his messages, his documentaries, and tries to continue his work to the extent that he can.
Thanks, Gulnaz. I think we should open up now.
And if you are watching us online, please also feel free to put questions in the chat box. I have YouTube on my phone and I can read and ask the questions for you. But yeah, does anyone have any questions?
Hi. I just wanted to ask about, last week at the St. Petersburg economic thing, they did the Russian Soviet flag, Russian imperial flag, and the Russian flag together next to the Gazprom Center thing. And I was and then that paired with things kind of like the directives towards education, where like in education, criticism of Soviet times, criticism of imperial times is kind of being discouraged. So to what extent is that maybe, I don't know, a shift in the identity that the government is trying to cultivate for the public, as in almost less of the kind of, as a result of how we collapsed in the 90s and the fall of the Soviet Union, but more, which is kind of a negative message in order to justify what you're doing, to more of like a positive message of we were the great Russian Empire, we were the great Soviet Union. And yeah, that's kind of my question. To what extent do you think that is a kind of accurate thing they're attempting to do? Like the government is trying to press itself. Are they doing that, or is it just a kind of happens to have happened?
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, so I think we see, at least from around 2013, this discourse which tries to show the long millennial history of the Russian existence and of Russian state, with its own culture, with its own ups and downs, but effectively trying to cultivate this idea that, and I think Putin has used even the term phoenix, that Russia is like this bird that burns but never dies. It always revives in one shape or another. And so this continuity and the sense of greatness and exceptionalism are part of the discourse today that are very important for the Russian society and for the public, that frequently, and especially today, finds itself, you know, sometimes in very difficult socioeconomic conditions, right? So in political psychology, one yet underdeveloped term that exists is collective narcissism, where the concept is that sometimes individuals can compensate for the individual sense of inadequacy, whether social, economic, financial, by seeing themselves as part of the large group that has all these great characteristics, features that they can be proud of. So, you know, something to study further, but the extent to which these Kremlin-propagated narratives and messaging work to, you know, not pacify people, but to make them feel important, to add maybe a manipulated sense of dignity into their life, when, you know, some of the things that stuck out with me recently are interviews with Vasily Sigarev, and Yana Trayanova, who were talking about they come from Urals, from Yekaterinburg, and from other, sort of closer to Siberia, and they have traveled there, and they're talking about there are no toilets, And I don't want to present Russia as this wild country, but there are many places, settlements, villages, small towns where you might have a problem still to find a functioning toilet, right? So if your surrounding is not giving you a sense of pride, especially if you compare yourself, add to this very high degree of inequality, right? And every town and city has, expressions of that inequality. So if your dignity is damaged by these comparisons and by the realization that 30 years into the post-Soviet development of new great Russia, what am I living in? Sometimes literally in, if I follow Vasily Sigorev's, focus on excrements, then you might find refuge in focusing on big things, such as your great state, your great state standing up to the other, Western civilization and the United States and other, as they're presented as imperial states, etc. So that provides you with a sense of dignity one way or another. So that might be one of the purpose of these strategic narratives that bring a whole of millennial Russian state culture and history into political legitimization and building a specific type of society and specific beliefs in your state, in your past, in your future, based on that past.
Thank you. I'm Anna Matveeva, King's College London. I'm Gulnaz's colleague. You mentioned kind of a resurrection of Soviet identity in modern conditions. And I want you to go a little bit more into that. Because Soviet Union was in existence for 70 years. Russia, modern Russia has been, half that time. But it's still a significant distance. It's 32 years since, then. What exactly is resurrecting? Because, again, Svetlana and I lived together through these times. The terms homo sovieticus was very much to describe people's behavior and values and attitudes internally. Homo sovieticus expects things from the state. It is very incapable of initiative. It will be dishonest given a chance. So that was very much kind of internal agenda. They pretend to pay, we pretend to work. What you just mentioned about the exceptionalism, about surrounded by enemies, everything points in the direction of external. Because, well, you can argue that modern generation doesn't know what was deficit, what it is like to be queuing for a number of years on a waiting list to get a car. So that features of Soviet line, which used to be very pronounced, that quite often determined people's life, are no longer there. So is it just a symbolic identity, or is it purely state manipulation? Is it something more than that?
So the term identity itself is sometimes ambiguous because in various disciplines it is referred to a different thing. How do you capture what identity is? And I think, Anna, your question comes from thinking about identity in a bit essentialist terms, in a sense that, there is a content of identities, certain meanings that we can ascribe to a specific group or collective. Now, in the book, I use identity forming mechanisms. So in my understanding of what identity is, so identity is a sense of belonging and the ideas that are linked to this sense of belonging. And the way I think about identity is that it's something that is constantly emerging, changing, and never some static sense that's out there, like a book where you can write it down. So it's, you know, our sense of belonging to something, to a group, is very much contextual, right? And it could be, you know, we have different identities, religious identities, national identities, you know, we all belong to the human race, we are sports fans, right? And each of these identities becomes salient and central to how we think about ourselves at specific moments, right? And so what I'm trying to show in the book, in the Red Mirror, is that the Russian belonging to the identity of belonging to the Russian state has been made very salient in Russian politics, and that this is the basis of Putin's popularity and of Kremlin's legitimation strategy. And what I try to claim is not the return of the Soviet identity, but the return of the Soviet ways and mechanisms that were used to make this sense of belonging to the state important. And thinking about exceptionalism and being surrounded by enemies, right? These are not contents about what Russia is about, that we're always surrounded by enemies. But when you always bring to your audience an image of an enemy, and the war, by the way, is number one, sort of the most extreme way, right, of showing to your public that there is an enemy because you are at war. That brings your belonging, your sense of belonging to Russia, most salient and most central. So at the war today, for Russians, is the key contextual element of making their Russian belonging more important than their religious affiliations, their ethnic affiliations, their sports or any other, their gender affiliations, in the context of war. Belonging to the Russian state that is fighting in this war is the most important thing. Right? So what I show is that the mechanisms, the sense of exceptionalism and its other part that we're, you know, everyone around us is against us, are the two pillars of creating that sense of belonging. Now, in terms of content, if we were to look for certain ideas, the symbolic landscape of the Russian identity today is very scarce, is very shallow. And one of the key elements in it is the victory in the World War II that has been capitalized to show, and Levada scholars in Levada Center talked about victory in World War II as this, you know, like there is a barren desert of symbols, and there is one thing that sticks out. It's this victory in World War II. It has been played on, manipulated, used, and promoted to say that Russians are a victorious people. They can do it, they can win, and we can do it again, etc. Now, and in the book also I refer to how the trauma of the 1990s. Today, part of Russian identity, as it is, or has been, at least until 2022, important in messaging is Russians are people who have gone through very painful transition of the 1990s that have sort of traumatized the society. So that was another important consolidating messaging narrative that played into creating this sense of belonging. So what are those ideas upon which we think that we agree that we all belong to the Russian state? What are those ideas? So today, those are some of the key ideas that I would suggest are important.
May I ask a question from myself? So in your speech now and answering previous questions, you've created almost an optimistic overview of some methodological through methodological, corrections or observations that, there is hope, there is a certain way of looking at things which, do not put the Russian society into this exceptional, doom situation. So, but on the other hand, those examples that you've mentioned, those women protesting against the war and Yuri Levada, it seemed that they've been failing politically. They had to leave, they haven't earned any political significance, and vice versa, you know, all the liberals within the Russian elites are silent, and we see the growing levels of conformity, of even complicity, I mean, and all of that is, of course, explainable. But at the same time, you know, you've mentioned this absolute methodology, which, you know, amateurishly I kind of understood as, you know, the system predetermines a certain, you know, certain attitudes and certain outlooks, and you say that that's obsolete, and, you know, we can question the validity of these results and conclusions. But then my question is, what is the alternative? And, you know, and if we do not focus on those people who actively, you know, protest the war and, you know, who are losing, and, you know, and in a situation when we do not have a chance to say that, you know, maybe in the future things will get better because Russia is now waging another imperialist war, and Ukrainians, you know, are actively fighting, and we cannot just calm ourselves saying, oh, probably out there are some people who, you know, are thinking some, you know, things which with which we can feel solidarity. So, and in these, you know, if we embrace this feeling of urgency, how we can, what kind of methodology can we think of, and to you know, to address the issues you are talking about?
So it's not about methodology. In methodology of research, if you're interested, we are having a 2-day conference on various methods of doing research, social science research, in the context of war, conflict, and authoritarianism. It's happening at King's College London. King's Russia Institute organized it. So, you know, access to data is a very separate question, but I think what you're asking is about more maybe principles that we can base our thinking about future and about the potential for change in Russia, and whether there is that potential, and to what extent the concepts that we use, the analytics that we rely on, allow us for that, for thinking about change, or they close off opportunities for change. So the essentialist, cultural, historically predetermined ways of thinking, they close off opportunities for change. Like if you say that Russia by its history is doomed towards specific ways of behaving, that it's ever aggressive, it's ever non-Western or against its neighbors, or ever imperialist, right? That's an essentializing way. Then you can point out to culture and Pushkin and look at how the best Russian authors, literary figures have reproduced certain ideas, right? You can go in that direction, but what does it mean for the future? In political strategy terms, this is a very politically what's the word? Short-sighted vision, because if you put all Russians under that umbrella, who do you have to work with to change that future? Or can you just negate that part of the world, a big part of the world? Can you just dream into non-existence, or think about some other radical ways to solve the problem? Probably in the Western societies, in democratic societies, in humanistic societies, we don't want to go in that direction. That means the only path that is left is to recognize that change is possible in any type of society, in any type of culture, and we have 20th century great examples of how that change happened quite successfully. And building on those examples, and I'm thinking about Germany and Japan and the World War II and the transformation of these societies into democracies, with all of its histories of Prussia, authoritarianism, First World War, Second World War, and yet we have new, democratically developed, globally integrated, peaceful, sometimes even pacifist, certainly well-operating societies that are good citizens in the world. And so the constructive way to do is to think about how to bring that potential future for Russia as well. We should not be idealistic. I am not a big optimist about the next few years and about how quick those changes, how fast those changes are possible and realistic. The cultural issues that I bring up in terms of racism, in terms of Orientalism, in terms of inter-ethnic hierarchies, those cultural issues are not easy problems to deal with. Think about racism in Western societies. I flew from Washington yesterday. Think about what's happening, you know, and the variable rate of progress on these issues and the potential left for populists and various politicians to capitalize, build on those issues again and again. And so that gives us a pause in terms of how idealistic and optimistic we should be about the potential for change. But that doesn't preclude the necessity to think about those necessary changes. These changes will require a big restructuring and transformation of Russia's political system and Russia's public space, and opening up media system, information flows, having a democratic government where power can change hands, where various societal interests can be articulated through organizations, parties, etc. And you know, that change is possible. It might take a while that road is traveled, but you know, I think you're asking a very good question about, you know, how each of us can think about, you know, what can we do, how can we support, how can we make a little step in that direction.
Thank you. My name's Gavin Meliwish. First of all, I'd like to apologize to those around me because I've been coughing a lot, but I just want to reassure you, I think it's a hay fevery thing and not anything contagious. Okay, so don't worry. My question, one thing that you haven't, well, you've mentioned in passing a couple of times, but didn't really touch on as a central topic, is the question of religion, okay? And I'm not sure if this is something you go into in your book or not. Unfortunately, I haven't read your book yet, though I look forward to doing so. Now, I think the assumption was, of course, that homo sovieticus was atheist, and yet now, in the Russia of the 21st century, particularly under the leadership of Putin, who's particularly keen on this, we see people falling over backwards to pretend that they are and always will be fantastically devoted Orthodox, okay? We're almost getting to a situation where, although theoretically, by the constitution, Russia is still a secular state, we see religious figures involved so often in state ceremonies that orthodoxy has also almost become de facto the state religion. Now, you mentioned something very interesting in your initial presentation, which is how the idea that Russia will be able to draw in future on the tremendous ethnic richness that it has as a source of strength. Having lived 7 years in Russia myself, I would fully agree with that. I think it's going to be a challenge for Russia, but it is definitely a potential source of strength. However, it strikes me that that will be very difficult to do in a Russia which has become almost de facto a religious Orthodox state. Now, how do you see the relationship between church and state developing in Russia now, well, in the immediate and medium-term future, and how do you think it will be possible to develop a multi-ethnic Russia and draw strength from that in a situation where Orthodoxy is almost the state religion?
That's a very good question. And so number one, formally, officially, rhetorically, and through the documents, in Russia there are 4 state-recognized religions, right? And we have seen a revival and a stronger following of all religions. I come originally from a Muslim Tatarstan, which is neighbored by Muslim Bashkortostan, of course the Caucasus, Muslim republics, and the building of new mosques, the attendance of namaz, the following of the fasting is very much present in these republics, right? So it wouldn't be correct to say that Russia has only gone Orthodox. right? Now, you are right about maybe the necessary in the future correction of the relationships between the state and the religion, because especially Orthodox Church has been very much associated with this specific political regime that has been also very much equated with the Russian state itself, right? So we have a case of, in a way, which is also historically quite strong as a legacy of the Russian state from Peter the Great and 18th century, when the relationships between the state and the church has been a little bit too, dominated by the state, and the church sort of following the imperative of legitimating regimes in the Russian state. So when I speak about the 19th century Russian exceptionalism and Moscow as a third Rome, you also have the usage of orthodoxy for legitimating the greatness of the Russian state. Now, in Russia of the future, there will need to be sort of a clear differentiation between the religious sphere of life and the political state sphere, and a recognition of different religions. And I think democracy might help, and changing power might help to go in that direction, so that the church and the mosques, the Muslim clergy are not used as part of the state, because this has been one of the unfortunate developments where religious sphere is very much politically appropriated and used to control society in Russia today.
We have a question online. How do you think this misunderstanding plays internationally, if at all, as the West might simply construe a Russia that fits their outlook, sometimes even showing complacency with authoritarianism? The person continues, I'm French and thinking of Macron's "we shouldn't humiliate Russia" stance in the early stages of the invasion of Ukraine. So how do you think this misunderstanding plays internationally, as the West might simply construe a Russia that fits their outlook, sometimes even showing complacency with authoritarianism?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because the issue of complacency of the West, right? We see the expressions and reflections of such complacency almost every day. Just recently there was a report about economic agents associated with the British royal family that has been part of the financial system that was helping Rothenbergs, etc. So there are chronic economic linkages, and Russian capital has been extremely strong. In the Western countries, Russia has bleeded capital throughout the years, with 2014 and 2022 being the biggest years for capital flight from Russia. So of course, there are and there were more, maybe with war, the situation has come more to attention, and there is a greater awareness of these issues of complacency, and there are more public discussions about the enablers of Russian, and not only Russian, but autocrats around the world, how they get to use financial system, global institutions, British courts for promoting their own interests. So in terms of public attention, academic and scholarly attention, these issues have been very much in the conversation. That doesn't quite respond to the issue of Macron and this issue of humiliation and recognition. And
yeah, I think the question is continuing the conversation. If they Russians are like that, we have to deal with that because we cannot change them. And if they're like that, we have to accept it and then deal with whatever image is beneficial to us in the West as a kind of as this ideal enemy or whatever.
Yeah, I think this thinking in terms of images and that we need to follow certain images is probably not quite politically productive, right? Like, it's important to identify certain important problems. Like in this case, if you have Russia that is a disruptive power that started war, and if we identify it's a personalist dictatorship where there is a very small group of people who is making decisions, and there is like one arbiter who, you know, is controlling situation. You know, you identify authoritarianism, autocracy, and dictatorship as a problem, and then you develop, as Western policymakers, a certain strategy for how to deal with this regime. What are various strategies, and what are the red lines in terms of recognizing or not humiliating, and what are, you know, the boundaries that the Western policymakers build to try to influence the system, to try to influence the regime and deal with it in that way.
You said during your talk that the Russian people are not fundamentally dissimilar in character from people elsewhere, and I agree. I think they want the same sort of things. It's also the case that politicians can develop patriotism and nationalism through well-tested and tried methods using religion, history, etc. What I think needs a lot more emphasis is the economic background. The Soviet Union collapsed largely for economic reasons and the failure to adjust. And Russia has gone from a rather extreme form of communism to a very extreme form of capitalism. And that is the background. And it seems to me that that is far more important, the economic background is far more important than the cultural things that you're referring to. Western societies, for better or worse, have managed to sustain production and distribution systems which are generally accepted. Mainly in the West, of course, through the price mechanism. But in the Soviet Union, there wasn't a price mechanism, and distribution, and indeed production, depended on political influences. What's happening now in Russia? Well, we have a society that is dominated by a very small group of people who own most of the resources. Production has largely collapsed. The industries that operated in the old Soviet Union have gone, and Russia is now very much a resource economy. And oil and gas. Who owns the oil and gas? Very, very few people. Are they the people behind Putin? I mean, it's obvious that Putin is going to try and sustain himself and his regime by developing patriotism, by trying to persuade the Russian people that he is a true Russian. He's true to the Orthodox Church, the imperial tradition, etc., etc. I think the economic background is far more important.
So, thank you very much for your comment. And I would invite you to read my first book that Denis mentioned, which is called Political Consequences of Chronic Capitalism Inside Russia, which speaks exactly to the issues of economic, socioeconomic, and institutional development of the Russian state, specifically in the 1990s and early 2000s, and looks at how the political economy of crony capitalism has emerged to bring about the high levels of inequality, but also to be characterized by very weak institutions that cannot protect property rights, and how in the conditions of such economic transformation and such institutional transformation, the foundations for accepting democracy and competitive elections become eroded because the key players for political positions involve not just politicians, as democracies work in the countries with secure property rights, but what I refer to as economic political networks, because access to a political position has incredibly higher stakes in a crony capitalist system in Russia than in the system where property rights are protected. The fight over politics becomes much more intense, dirty, and in the end, delegitimizing the whole concept of competition and elections. That's how Putin came to power. That's how he went in 2004 to abolish regional elections. That's how the road towards autocracy and authoritarianism and personal dictatorship started out with. So you are absolutely right that the issues are not only cultural in nature, but they have to do something to do with the socioeconomic development. And in the end, when I spoke about the difficulty of addressing cultural issues, such as the issue of interethnic hierarchies and relationships, these public debates could only happen in a society where individuals have prospects for economic progress and therefore social progress and educational progress and critical thinking, and not because the ethnic hierarchies and identity politics are frequently played out in the context of lesser educated people, lesser educated societies, where manipulation, political manipulation, emotional politics are much easier to do than in a society, in a highly educated society with critical thinkers who understand what's happening in politics and who can decipher the various manipulative messages and when politicians play on their emotions. So, but these public debates, discussions, conversations could only happen when societies reach certain degree of economic stability, economic security. You cannot speak about ethnic hierarchies if you have fears for survival, for your economic existence. That's where immigrants' fears come to play. When people are competing for jobs and they're insecure about their future, and about the next day, and then they start, Mexicans are stealing our jobs, or Syrians, or Turkish, or who not, right, in Western societies. So the only way to withstand such identity politics, such manipulative techniques coming from populists, is to have, you know, societies where you have a certain degree of socioeconomic development, educational achievement, and absent high degree of inequality.
Hello, thank you very much for your speech today. I wanted to ask on this note of capitalism. I also lived in Russia. I was very surprised how popular ideas of Ayn Rand are. Ayn Rand. So, yeah, especially on this very sort of extreme libertarian vision that somehow go very, very well together with this wild capitalism that developed in the 90s. So this was my first question. Second question is about the excess of Orientalism that part of the academia, not only the academia, also the political community in general, uses like to address to Russia. And so we can really see this sort of rhetoric taken in a bit dogmatic way, that no change is possible. They've gone through so many years of changes, but however with authoritarian tendencies. However, how can one also decompose such an argument when analyzing the matters empirically? One sees that despite even the very prominent changes that have been since the 19th century, some specific attitudes and behaviors were like kept presenting themselves, and kept presenting themselves even in contradiction with the dominant political rhetoric. For example, the Soviet Union legitimized always itself as a anti-colonial, anti-imperial. However, there were deportations. There was many examples of divide et impera done by Stalin. One can also look at, I don't know, the Virgin Land, in Kazakhstan as a perfect example of a very imperial attitude towards, at least, I don't know, I have a certain form of identity and so on. So this is my question. So on the one hand, I agree that this excess of Orientalism that doesn't necessarily, simplifies a bit and doesn't necessarily play a good cause. However, on the other hand, we observe that it's very difficult to empirically argue against it when we look at Russia's past and also present.
I'll start with the second one. On the second question about the contradictions in the Soviet society and system on the issue of multinational relationships, I would recommend that you read a book that was published by Bloomsbury Shorts by Bridget O'Keefe. I was trying to find its correct title, but it's about friendship of peoples. It has that
multi-ethnic Soviet Union and its demise.
Multi-ethnic Soviet Union, Bridget O'Keefe, right? She presented here, right? Yeah. So that would be probably the best, at the moment, introduction to those blind spots that I've mentioned, referred to, Bridget O'Keefe's book. On your first question about Ayn Rand and the popularity of libertarianism and of these radical liberal ideas, I would, if I may, compare the period of time of this, what we sometimes refer to as wild capitalism, to the period of time in the US history that in the late 19th century that took a name of social Darwinism. It was also a moment of the development of these big robber barons, like oligarchs almost, who were building the railroads, etc., and how this period gave rise to further progressivism in the American history from the early 20th century, starting from social gospel and people from the religious sphere coming to the public and saying, you cannot be happy and rich by yourself if the others in your community are left behind. And that started, along with the muckrakers and the anti-corruption journalism, that started the period of progressive era changes in the United States. Now, somewhat similar developments could be observed in the Russian post-Soviet history as well, with this early enthusiasm and the wild capitalism, developments, enrichment, greed, and ideology of greed becoming widely shared and widely spread. But, as the first generation went away and we are coming into 2000s, from exactly 20 years into the changes, so almost one generation out, we see the rise of new ideas that counter this wild capitalism. And so when I brought in the civic orientations by Dudes, he built on orientations that were already observable in the society from around 2010s, starting with this was in the urban areas, especially Moscow, the well-to-do, where you had middle-class development that is autonomous from the state, where people were becoming more autonomous financially, more cosmopolitan in their outlooks, traveling, more resourceful, but at the same time, they started developing these civic orientations that were shown in various big incidents in the Russian history, like the fires, and how people organized to fight the fires, in a way replacing or compensating for state action. And fires was just one example. There was another in the south. There were some floods, reaction to floods. There were these civic organizing around looking for, what's it called, Lisa or Lisa Alert, where kids or individuals would be lost, and there were just societal organization sort of non-state at all to organize quickly to find lost kids or, you know, adults, say if they have, you know, Parkinson's, Alzheimer, or mental, etc., and they go into the forest, get lost, and then you have this societal organization. So a lot of these examples of rise of civicness were observable, and I would say that they suggested, once again, the social dynamics that evolves as, you know, economic prosperity and economic autonomy from the state brings to society, and what type of progressive, good-natured social changes it can bring. Now, the situation has shifted in the different direction. What we have today is an increasing dependence on the state, with the Kremlin and the government very much realizing and aware of how easy it is to control and manipulate society that depends for child benefits, social support, all kinds of problems. So if you look at the state bureaucracy and people affiliated with the state, the numbers, how they have grown, how the number of social packages has grown, and it works on the one hand to say that this is a part of the program of fighting poverty, which is necessary, but it also makes people dependent on the state, thus reviving certain Soviet sort of state paternalist features in the society that might not be good for, are not good for freedom, for pluralism, for access to information, and for people demanding these political and civic rights in their life.
Do we have any more questions? If we do not have any questions, then what is left to thank you, Gulnaz and Svetlana, for your wonderful discussion. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for your questions. And please buy Gulnaz's book downstairs, and we are still open for another half an hour, so we have cold wine and beer in the bar, and hopefully we can continue the conversation in a more unofficial setting for a bit. Thank you.